Everyone pictures the Titanic's first-class dining room, crystal chandeliers, 11-course meals, champagne flowing like water. But what about the 709 people crammed into third class? Spoiler alert, they weren't eating caviar. In fact, what they were eating would shock you. Not because it was terrible, but because it was better than what most of them ate at home. Yes, you heard that right. The doomed passengers in steerage were eating better on their way to disaster than they did in their regular lives. If you love history, weird stories, and meals that make you grateful for modern food safety standards, welcome to Food Storic. Hit subscribe before we dive into what was actually on the menu. April 10th, 1912. Southampton, England. You've just handed over between £3 and £8 sterling for your third-class ticket. That's roughly $450 to $1,200 today, adjusted for inflation. For many passengers, this represents their entire life savings. You're emigrating to America, leaving everything behind. The White Star Line promises meals included. What they don't tell you is that you're about to eat better than you have in years. Here's where it gets weird. Third-class passengers on the Titanic were served meat twice a day. Twice. Keep in mind, this was 1912. The average working-class family in Britain ate meat maybe once a week, if they were lucky. On Sundays. The rest of the week, bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetables were cheap. But on the Titanic, different story, entirely. Let me put this in perspective. A skilled laborer in 1912, Britain earned about £2 per week. That's roughly $300 in today's money. Beef cost about 10 pence per pound. Adjusted for inflation, that's like paying $15 for a pound of ground beef today, except you're earning minimum wage. The math doesn't work. You simply couldn't afford it. But White Star Line could. They bought in bulk. They had contracts. They had refrigeration. Oh, that beautiful, beautiful refrigeration. The Titanic had state-of-the-art refrigerated storage. We're talking about 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 40,000 eggs, 40 tons of potatoes. This ship was basically a floating grocery store. A really fancy, really doomed grocery store. Let's talk breakfast. You wake up at 6 a.m. to the sound of 700 other people also waking up. The smell hits you first. Not the unwashed bodies, though that's definitely present. No, it's the smell of actual cooked food. Porridge, but not the thin gruel you're used to. This is thick, hearty oatmeal porridge. With milk. Real milk. Not the watered-down, questionably fresh stuff from the cart outside your tenement. Fresh milk from the ship's refrigerated stores. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on how you feel about historical irony. Alongside that porridge, fresh bread. Not day-old, not week-old. Fresh. Baked that morning in the ship's bakeries. Yes, bakeries plural. The Titanic had multiple bakeries running 24/7. They produced 1,000 loaves per day. For context, a typical working-class family rationed one loaf to last 3 days. And the portion sizes, absolutely mental by 1912 standards. You're looking at a bowl of porridge that would feed a family of 4 back home. A chunk of bread the size of your fist. And here's the kicker. Seconds were available. Seconds. In an era where people carefully counted every crumb, where mothers went without so their children could eat, third-class passengers could go back for more food. But here's where class distinctions still mattered. Third class ate in shifts. 2 sittings for each meal. Why? Because the dining room only held 473 people, with 709 third-class passengers, plus children who didn't count in the official numbers. You're looking at organized chaos. First sitting at 6 a.m., second at 7:30. Miss your sitting? Too bad. No room service in steerage. The breakfast beverage situation tells its own story. Tea or coffee included in your fare. Sugar and milk provided. Do you understand how insane this was? Sugar was a luxury. Most working-class families used treacle or nothing. Coffee was for special occasions. On the Titanic, every morning, as much as you wanted. Now, about that Swedish bread. Yes, Swedish bread specifically. White Star Line wasn't stupid. They knew their demographics. Third class was full of Scandinavians heading to Minnesota and Wisconsin. So alongside the standard British fare, they served Swedish bread, Finnish bread, black bread, It was honestly more culturally diverse than first class, where everyone ate French food regardless of whether they could pronounce it. Lunch rolled around at noon. They called it dinner because working class people called their midday meal dinner and their evening meal tea. Confusing, yes. But White Star Line knew their audience. This wasn't about teaching etiquette. This was about feeding people who'd paid their life savings for this journey. The lunch menu on April 14th, the day of the sinking, would make a modern food blogger weep. Rice soup to start. Sounds boring. This isn't your sad leftover rice and water. This is proper soup with vegetables, properly seasoned. For many passengers, seasoning beyond salt was a revelation. Pepper was still expensive on land. On the ship, already in the soup. Then came the main course, fresh meat. On April 14th, it was roast beef, actual roast beef, with gravy, with potatoes, with vegetables, the kind of Sunday dinner that most passengers saw maybe 4 times a year. Christmas, Easter, and if they were very lucky, 2 other occasions. Here, random Sunday, because every day was Sunday dinner money when the meals were included. Portion control was optimistic. White Star Line calculated food quantities based on shoreside consumption. What they didn't factor in was that people who'd been hungry their entire lives would eat like they might never see food again, which tragically, many wouldn't. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The vegetables deserve mention. Boiled potatoes, yes, but also turnips, carrots, parsnips. Fresh vegetables in April meant they'd been stored properly through winter or shipped from warmer climates. Either way, expensive. The kind of expensive that meant most passengers were used to sprouted potatoes and woody turnips. On the Titanic, everything was fresh. Everything was good. It was suspicious how good it was. Plum pudding for dessert. Let that sink in. Plum pudding wasn't actually made with plums. It was made with raisins, sweet, flour, and spices. The ingredients alone would cost a week's wages on shore. Here, Tuesday dessert. Just another Tuesday where third-class passengers ate desserts they'd normally see only at Christmas. But here's the thing about maritime law and food. Ships were required to carry enough provisions for the journey, plus 50% extra. The Board of Trade mandated specific quantities. But White Star Line went beyond. Way beyond. They carried enough food to feed everyone for 3 weeks. The journey was supposed to take 7 days. Why so much extra? Brand reputation. Also, icebergs weren't supposed to be that far south in April. Surprise. Tea time. That's the evening meal, not actual tea time. Though tea was served then too. Confusing British meal names aside, this was when things got interesting. The evening meal was lighter than lunch, but still substantial by 1912 standards. Bread and butter. Sounds simple? This was white bread. Fresh butter. Not margarine, which was what poor people ate. Real butter from the ship's refrigerated stores. The variety at tea time showed White Star Line's understanding of their passengers. Gruel again, but sweetened this time. What they didn't know, however, was that many passengers had never tasted sweetened gruel. Sugar in your porridge was rich people behavior. Here, standard, default. Diabetes wasn't invented yet, apparently. Cheese showed up at tea time, too. Not fancy cheese. Basic cheddar. But consistent quality. Consistent availability. Onshore, cheese quality varied wildly based on what you could afford. Usually, you bought the stuff just before it went bad because it was cheaper. On the Titanic, fresh cheese. Every day, the luxury of consistency. And the jam. Sweet, merciful jam. Fruit preserves were expensive. Sugar plus fruit plus the fuel to cook it. That's 3 separate expenses most families couldn't manage. But on the ship, jam for your bread. Every evening. Different flavors on different days. Strawberry, apricot, marmalade. Flavors most passengers knew existed, but rarely tasted. The drink options tell their own story of class and chemistry. Water was available, but nobody trusted it. Even with the ship's modern filtration system, a lifetime of bad water made passengers suspicious. Beer was not included in third class. You had to buy it. A pint cost 4 pence. Doesn't sound like much until you remember that was an hour's wages for many passengers. But here's where it gets dark humor dark. Many passengers spent their coins on beer anyway. They'd saved for months to afford this journey. What's a few more pence? Besides, they were heading to America, the land of opportunity. They'd make it back. The band playing on deck would play Nearer My God to Thee soon enough. But right now, they were rich enough to buy beer on a ship. The children's situation was actually better than the adults. White Star Line provided free milk for all children under 1 year. Free. In an era where infant mortality was often linked to bad milk or no milk, this was huge. Condensed milk was available for older children. Not ideal nutritionally, but shelf-stable and safe. Safety mattered more than nutrition when the alternative was potentially contaminated fresh milk. Children also got special porridge, finer ground, easier to digest, with extra sugar. The stewards were instructed to ensure children ate first at every meal, partially humanitarian, partially practical. Hungry children are loud children. 700 third-class passengers in confined spaces meant noise management mattered. Let's talk about the kosher situation, or rather, the complete lack of it. White Star Line made zero provisions for religious dietary restrictions in third class. Jewish passengers had to make do with vegetarian options. Fish when it was served, lots and lots of potatoes. Some brought their own food, packed carefully in tins. Those tins are probably still at the bottom of the Atlantic. Rusting monuments to dietary laws. The medical dietary provisions were surprisingly advanced. Passengers with documented medical conditions could request special diets. Bland food for stomach troubles. Extra milk for tuberculosis patients. Yes, they let TB patients travel in third class. Different times. The ship's hospital had special dietary kitchens. Not for third class specifically, but they'd make exceptions. Sometimes. Food storage in third class was basically non-existent. You ate what they served when they served it. No refrigerators, no pantries. Some passengers brought food from home. Hard cheese, dried sausages, dense bread meant to last. By day 3, most of it was gone. Shared with neighbors, traded for cigarettes, consumed in homesick moments. The smell of familiar food in unfamiliar surroundings. The dining room itself needs description. Long wooden tables. Benches, not chairs. Swiveling seats in some areas, fixed in others. White painted walls that showed every scuff. Electric lights, which was still novel for many passengers. The floor was linoleum, easy to clean. They cleaned it constantly. 700 people eating meant constant mess. No tablecloths in third class. Bare wood, scrubbed between sittings. Metal plates and cups. Sturdy cutlery, though they counted it carefully. Losing cutlery meant accusations of theft. The assumption that poor people would steal anything not nailed down. Ironically, after the sinking, these humble forks and knives would become valuable Titanic memorabilia, if any survived. The serving style was family-style boarding house rules. Big bowls of food placed on tables. First come, best served. This led to strategic sitting. Experienced travelers knew to sit near where servers emerged from the kitchens. Families developed systems. One person saves seats, another scouts the serving patterns. Survival strategies for ensuring everyone ate. But here's the thing about communal dining. It built community. By day 3, the same people sat in the same spots. Conversations developed. Swedish families teaching English words to Italian kids. Irish women sharing gossip with Norwegian wives. The dining room became the social center. More so than the limited common areas. Food brings people together, even when that togetherness is heading toward an iceberg. The seasickness situation was brutal. First day out, half the dining room was empty. All that beautiful food going to waste because passengers were too sick to eat. The crew had remedies. Dry bread, weak tea, ginger if you were lucky. But mostly, you suffered. And when you finally felt better, you ate like you'd never see food again. Prophetic for some. White Star Line actually profited from seasickness. Less food consumed meant lower costs. They calculated for it. Assumed 30% reduced consumption for the first 2 days. Cold mathematics applied to human misery. Though to be fair, they did provide buckets. So many buckets. The laundry situation must have been a nightmare. The bread deserves its own discussion. That fresh daily bread wasn't just fresh. It was good. The ship's bakers were professionals. They knew their craft. The flour was high quality, shipped from Canadian mills. The ovens were modern, coal-fired but temperature-controlled. The bread that emerged was better than what most passengers could buy at home. Third class went through approximately 1,000 pounds of bread daily. That's not counting what first and second class consumed. Just third class. 700 people destroying nearly half a ton of bread every single day. The ovens ran 24 hours, shifts of bakers working through the night so passengers could wake up to fresh bread. The meat situation is where things get interesting. All that fresh meat I mentioned, it had to be used in order. Refrigeration in 1912 wasn't perfect. The beef went first, then the mutton, then the preserved meats. By the end of a typical voyage, you'd be eating salt pork. But the Titanic never got that far. Those third-class passengers ate fresh meat until the very end. The fish served was mostly preserved. Salt cod, pickled herring. Fresh fish was for first class. But here's the thing. Preserved fish was familiar to many third-class passengers. Scandinavians grew up on pickled herring. Catholics ate salt cod every Friday. This was comfort food. Reminders of home served on white plates instead of newspaper. The cooking. Methods were basic, but effective. Boiling, roasting, stewing. No fancy French techniques in the third-class galleys. But when you're cooking with decent ingredients, simple works. A properly roasted joint of beef doesn't need béarnaise sauce. It needs salt, heat, and time. The third-class cooks had all three. Let me tell you about the potatoes. 40 tons of potatoes. 40 tons. That's 80,000 pounds of potatoes. For a 7-day journey, do the math. That's over 11,000 pounds of potatoes per day. For 2,200 people total on board, 5 pounds of potatoes per person per day. Of course, first class wasn't eating 5 pounds of potatoes. This was third-class fuel. Potatoes were everything in third class. Boiled for lunch, mashed for dinner, sometimes roasted if the cooks felt fancy. Potato soup when stores ran low, which they never did because, again, 40 tons. The Irish passengers must have felt some kind of way about it, fleeing the land of potato famines to eat potatoes on the Atlantic. The milk situation shows the class divide perfectly. First class had cream for their coffee. Second class had full-fat milk. Third class had milk, but it was often diluted. Not criminally diluted like shoreside, but stretched to make sure everyone got some. The children's milk was never diluted. That was sacred. You didn't mess with children's milk. But here's what kills me about the whole thing. The third-class breakfast on the Titanic was better than what first-class passengers on earlier ships ate. Progress is weird like that. What was luxury in 1850 was standard by 1912. What was standard in 1912 would be considered cruel and unusual today. Except for the portions. The portions were generous even by today's standards. The sugar consumption was astronomical. Sugar in porridge, sugar in tea, sugar in coffee, jam and preserves loaded with sugar. Plum pudding more sugar than plum. For passengers used to honey if they were lucky, treacle if they were very lucky. This was insane. Their teeth didn't know what hit them. Neither did their pancreases. Salt was the silent killer. Everything was salted. The preserved meats, obviously, but also the fresh meat, for flavor. The vegetables, for cooking. The bread had salt. The butter was salted. For people already dealing with poor health, this sodium bomb was problematic. But it tasted good. And when you've been hungry, taste matters more than tomorrow. The crew eating arrangements were fascinating. Officers ate different food than regular crew. Crew ate different food than steerage passengers. But sometimes there was overlap. Leftover plum pudding from third class might end up in crew quarters. Likewise, crew stew might supplement third-class portions if supplies ran low. They never ran low on the Titanic. But the system existed. Speaking of crew, let's talk about the servers. Third class had dedicated stewards. Not as many as first class, obviously, but enough to serve 700 people in 2 sittings. These weren't trained waiters. These were working-class guys who needed jobs. They served food like they were feeding family. Efficiently. No nonsense. Keep the line moving. The language barrier was real. Instructions in English. Passengers speaking Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, Italian, Yiddish, Arabic. The universal language of pointing at food worked well enough. Though misunderstandings happened. Pork served to Muslims, meat on Fridays to devout Catholics. Cultural sensitivity wasn't a hiring requirement. But the crew tried. Some learned basic phrases. More? Finished. Good. Simple communications that made the journey easier. The good stewards were remembered. Passengers would seek them out. Tip them if they had coins. These relationships mattered. When the ship started sinking, some stewards tried to help their passengers. Failed, mostly, but tried. The food waste was minimal. Working-class passengers didn't waste food. Couldn't afford to mentally, even when they could afford it physically. Leftover bread went in pockets, extra portions shared with neighbors, mothers hoarding jam packets for children. The abundance was too new to trust. Better to save, just in case. What they didn't know, however, was that saving food in third class was nearly impossible. No refrigeration in cabins, no sealed containers. That saved bread went stale. That hoarded cheese went bad. The ship's abundance only lasted as long as you were in the dining room. Outside, you were on your own. The special meals tell their own story. Easter was coming. The ship would have served special meals. Hot cross buns. Maybe lamb. Definitely eggs. The kitchens were prepared. Orders placed. Supplies loaded. All that special food went down with the ship. Fish food now. The most expensive fish food in the Atlantic. Children's birthday celebrations happened in that dining room. No cakes from the pastry kitchen that was first class only. But stewards would stick a candle in bread pudding, sing badly translated birthday songs. Other passengers would clap. Small humanites in the middle of the ocean. The kinds of things that don't make history books, but mattered to the people there. The comparison to shore food is stark. A typical working-class breakfast on land. Tea and bread. Maybe porridge if you were lucky. Margarine, not butter. Sugar was a Sunday treat. Meat was a once-a-week luxury. Fresh vegetables? Seasonal at best. Expensive always. The Titanic's third-class menu was literally better than Christmas dinner for most passengers. But here's the dark irony. They served dinner on April 14th as usual. Full portions. Multiple courses. Passengers ate well. Complained about the cod being too salty. Worried about gaining weight from all the starch. Made plans for what they'd eat in New York. Had no idea they had less than 6 hours left. The last meal served was tea time. Bread and butter. Cheese. That sweet gruel. Some passengers were still eating when the iceberg hit. Imagine that. Your last meal being White Star Line third-class tea service. There are worse ways to go, but also, there are much better ways to go. When the ship started listing, the galleys flooded first. Being below decks has disadvantages. All that food, those 40 tons of potatoes, those thousands of loaves of bread, gone. The ovens that never stopped running, stopped. The refrigerators that kept everything fresh, darker than the Atlantic. The abundance ended as suddenly as it began. The lifeboats had emergency rations, but third-class passengers didn't get many lifeboats, so those emergency rations, hardtack and water, mostly went to first and second-class survivors. The third-class passengers who made it onto lifeboats often had nothing. No food, no water, just the memory of their last meal in the dining room. Survivors talked about the food, how good it was, how much there was, how it made them feel rich for a few days. They'd paid their life savings for the journey, and for 7 days, they ate like kings. Working-class kings. But kings nonetheless. It was the kind of story you told grandchildren. If you lived to have grandchildren, the manifest listed provisions loaded, but not people fed. We know how many pounds of beef went down with the ship. We don't know how many final meals were interrupted. We know the exact quantity of flour in the holds. We don't know which baker was working when the water rushed in. Numbers preserve. Stories sink. Modern cruise ships learned from the Titanic. Not just about lifeboats, about food service, about class distinctions, about feeding people who've saved everything for this journey. Today's cruise passengers complain if the buffet runs out of shrimp. Third-class passengers on the Titanic were grateful for fresh bread. Perspective changes everything. The legacy of those meals lives on in weird ways. Titanic museums serve third-class dinner experiences, sanitized versions, the real portions, but not the real context. You can't replicate the hunger that made that food precious, the uncertainty that made abundance suspicious, the hope that made every meal a celebration of the future. When adjusted for inflation, those third-class tickets cost serious money, but included food that would cost even more if purchased separately. White Star Line took a loss on every third-class passenger, gambling on volume and reputation. They won the reputation game, lost the iceberg game. History remembers both. I've tried recreating some of these meals. The porridge is actually good, hearty, filling, the kind of breakfast that keeps you full until lunch. The roast beef, when done properly, is delicious. Simple food done well beats complicated food done poorly every time. Those third-class cooks understood the assignment. The plum pudding is an acquired taste, dense, sweet, heavy. The kind of dessert that makes sense when you've been doing physical labor all day. When you need calories, because calories mean survival. When sugar is rare enough to be special. In our world of abundant sweetness, it's too much. In their world, it was just right. The real tragedy isn't that they died. People die. Ships sink. The real tragedy is that for many passengers, those 7 days were the best-fed days of their lives. They thought it was the beginning, the start of American abundance. Instead, it was the end, the last good meal, the final abundance before the cold. But here's the thing. They didn't know it was the end. Right up until the moment they couldn't ignore the list anymore, they thought this was the beginning. They ate their meals, planning future meals. They saved bread, thinking about tomorrow's breakfast. They went to bed full, believing they'd wake up hungry in New York. That's not tragic. That's human. The Titanic's third-class dining remains a perfect snapshot of 1912 class dynamics. Not cruel like earlier ships. Not egalitarian like modern ones. Stuck in between. Good enough to be generous. Not good enough to be equal. Fresh bread for everyone. Different bread for the rich. Progress measured in portion sizes. Would you have survived on that menu? Physically, absolutely. The calories were there. The nutrition was adequate. Not optimal, but adequate. Scurvy took weeks to develop. The journey was 7 days. B vitamin deficiencies? Same timeline. The menu would keep you alive and functional, which is more than most passengers got on land. Mentally surviving is different. The abundance would be suspicious. The generosity would feel like a trap. When you've been hungry, your whole life, fullness feels temporary. Every meal could be the last. Ironically, one meal was the last. But they didn't know that. They just knew they were full. For once. The crew who survived remembered the waste, all that food at the bottom of the ocean. Enough to feed a small town for weeks. Gone in 2 hours and 40 minutes. They'd spent careers managing portions, calculating supplies, preventing waste, then watched it all sink. Some never worked ships again. The story of third-class dining on the Titanic is really a story about dreams. Dreams of full bellies in a new country. Dreams of children who'd never know hunger. Dreams of work that paid enough for meat twice a week. Dreams served with fresh bread and real butter. Dreams that sank in freezing water. But for 7 days, those dreams tasted delicious. And maybe that's enough. Maybe 7 days of eating like you matter is better than a lifetime of knowing you don't. The last entry in the kitchen log shows bread orders for April 15th, 1,000 loaves. Business as usual. The ovens were heating. The flour was measured. The bakers were ready. Tomorrow would bring fresh bread, just like every other day. Except tomorrow never came. The bread was never baked. The flour never used. The abundance ended mid-recipe. And that's the real lesson of third-class dining on the Titanic. Sometimes you get 7 days of unexpected plenty. Sometimes the journey ends before the destination. Sometimes the last meal is just a meal, not a farewell. But every meal eaten with hope is a celebration, whether you know it or not. Those third-class passengers didn't get their American dreams. But for 7 days, they ate like those dreams were possible. In the end, maybe that's its own kind of victory. A well-fed tragedy is still a tragedy. But at least nobody died hungry. The restored menus from the Titanic show simple food prepared simply. No exotic ingredients masked by French names. Just beef and potatoes and bread. Working class food elevated by freshness and abundance. Proof that good ingredients don't need complicated preparations. Proof that feeding people well doesn't require a Michelin star. Those third-class passengers paid between £3 and £8 for their tickets. In today's money, adjusting for inflation, that's between $450 and $200. For that, they got transportation and 3 meals a day for a week. Run the numbers. That's about $20 to $50 per day for accommodation and full board. Even adjusting for inflation, that's value. Deadly value, but value nonetheless. The real question isn't what they ate. We know what they ate. The real question is what it meant. For a Finnish family fleeing poverty, that fresh bread meant hope. For an Irish laborer heading to Boston, the roast beef proved America's promises might be real. For a Jewish immigrant carefully avoiding the pork, those potatoes were a bridge between old world and new. Food is never just food. It's possibility dressed as produce. And that's what was eaten in third class on the Titanic. Not just porridge and beef and too many potatoes. Dreams were eaten. Futures were tasted. Hope was served 3 times daily with seconds available. The fact that those dreams sank doesn't diminish their flavor. For 7 days in April 1912, 709 third-class passengers ate like their better days had arrived. They had. They just didn't last very long. But while they lasted, they tasted wonderful.